Waukesha, November 2021. Hot cocoa, diesel, the rhythmic pulse of a marching band. Then, the rhythm breaks. A red SUV, cold, mechanical, relentless, tears through the barricades at 40 miles per hour. It does not swerve for the children. It does not brake for the elderly. In seconds, festive brass is silenced by the sickening thud of metal against bone. This was no failure of mechanics. This was the roar of a man using 4,000 pounds of steel to settle a petty, narcissistic score. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the carnage of that November afternoon, one must first look at the 50-page ledger of failures that preceded it. Darrell Brooks Jr. was not a ghost in the system. He was a frequent flyer. By the time he reached the age of 39, his life was less a biography and more a revolving door of courthouse corridors and cinder-block cells. His criminal record stretched across 3 decades and multiple states: Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, leaving behind a trail of victims that the legal system seemed to forget as quickly as it processed them. It began in the late 90s, a steady drumbeat of aggravated battery, carrying concealed weapons and drug possession. In Nevada, he was a registered sex offender, a title earned after a 2006 conviction for statutory sexual seduction. In Georgia, there were more batteries, more arrests for obstructing officers. Back in Wisconsin, the record grew thick with counts of bail jumping and reckless endangerment. He was a man who viewed the law not as a boundary, but as a suggestion, a nuisance to be bypassed with a sob story or a procedural oversight. But Brooks didn't see himself as a career criminal. In his mind, he was a star waiting for a stage. Under the moniker Math Boy Fly, he attempted to carve out a career in the Milwaukee rap scene. His music videos, produced on a shoestring budget, were a window into a hollow, narcissistic world. In these videos, he postured with stacks of cash and jewelry, projecting an image of power and street-level authority. But looking back at those frames today, there is a chilling, prophetic detail that stands out. In the background of his performances, parked casually on the street, sat the red Ford Escape. The same vehicle that would eventually become a weapon of mass casualty was, for months, merely a prop in his fantasies of fame. It was a utilitarian vessel for a man who believed the world owed him a spotlight, no matter who he had to climb over to reach it. The most damning chapter of his history, however, was written just 20 days before the parade. On November 2nd, Brooks was arrested for a series of violent acts that should have kept him behind bars indefinitely. He was accused of punching the mother of his child in the face, and then, with a cold-blooded lack of hesitation, running her over with that same red SUV in a gas station parking lot. It was a dry run for the massacre to come. He was charged with second-degree recklessly endangering safety, felony bail jumping, and battery. Then the system broke. Despite his violent history, despite the fact that he was already out on bail for a different case involving a firearm, a Milwaukee County Assistant District Attorney requested a bail of just $1,000. It was a sum so inappropriately low that even the district attorney's office would later call it a mistake. It was a clerical error that functioned as a death warrant for the citizens of Waukesha. On November 11th, Brooks scraped together the cash and walked out of the Milwaukee County Jail. He was a free man, fueled by the knowledge that he could crush a human being under his tires and be back on the street for the price of a used motor scooter. Friends and family described his state of mind in the following days as a ticking clock, a man perpetually on the edge of a domestic explosion. He was living in that red SUV, parked outside his mother's house, a cramped and airless space where his resentment could fester. He was broke, he was angry, and he felt the walls closing in. He didn't have a plan to attack a parade. He didn't have the discipline for a grand conspiracy. Instead, he possessed something far more volatile, a complete lack of empathy coupled with an explosive, hair-trigger temper. He was a man who saw every inconvenience as an assault on his ego, and he was prepared to retaliate with everything he had left. The air in Wisconsin was turning sharp as the holiday season approached. In Waukesha, families were untangling strings of lights and practicing their instrumentals. They were preparing for a tradition of joy. Daryl Brooks, meanwhile, was sitting in a red Ford Escape, staring at the dashboard, waiting for a reason to snap. The spark that would eventually ignite the center of Waukesha didn't start with a political grievance or a calculated plot. It started in the suffocating, repetitive cycle of a toxic relationship. To understand why Darrell Brooks turned his steering wheel toward a crowd of children, one must understand the 15-year tether between him and Erica Patterson, a bond forged not in affection, but in the relentless gravity of domestic control. Erica had spent over a decade as the primary target of Brooks's internal storms. Their history was a map of bruises and broken promises, stretching from the suburbs of Georgia to the cold streets of Milwaukee. She was the mother of his child, but in the twisted architecture of Brooks' mind, she was more of a possession, a metric by which he measured his own power. When he felt small, he made sure she felt smaller. When the world ignored his math boy fly persona, he ensured Erica acknowledged his dominance with her silence or her scars. The relationship had reached a lethal crescendo just weeks prior at a local gas station, where he had allegedly used the very same red Ford Escape to knock her to the pavement. That incident had landed him in a cell, but thanks to the catastrophic bail oversight, he was back in her orbit by late November. He hadn't used his freedom to find a job or seek help. He had used it to resume his hunt. He was living out of the SUV, a cramped, mobile headquarters for his resentment, frequently parking near where Erica stayed, watching, waiting for the inevitable friction of their next encounter. The morning of November 21st, 2021, began with the kind of biting Wisconsin cold that turns the breath into a ghost. Brooks was on edge. He was broke, he was hungry, and his ego was brittle. He began blowing up Erica's phone, a digital barrage of demands and accusations. He wanted to meet. He claimed he had things to discuss, but the subtext was always the same. He needed to assert his presence. Erica, perhaps hoping that a public setting would offer a shield, agreed to meet him at Frame Park, a scenic 60-acre stretch of greenery nestled along the Fox River. By mid-afternoon, the park was a snapshot of suburban peace. Families were walking dogs, and the distant, muffled sound of the high school marching bands warming up for the parade could be heard drifting on the wind from the downtown area, just 3/4 of a mile away. Brooks arrived in the red SUV, the engine idling with a low, mechanical growl that felt out of place against the quiet of the riverbank. When Erica arrived, the discussion dissolved almost instantly into the familiar rhythm of a domestic ambush. Brooks wasn't there to talk. He was there to extort. He demanded that Erica hand over her phone, or perhaps give him money he felt he was owed. The specifics of the petty argument mattered less than the escalating volume of his rage. He cornered her near the vehicle, his posture aggressive, his movements jagged. Witnesses later described the scene as a man possessed by a specific localized fury. He allegedly struck her again, the physical exclamation point to his verbal assault. But on this day, the cycle broke in a way Brooks hadn't anticipated. Erica didn't retreat into the usual submissive silence. She pulled away. She sought out her friends who were nearby, and together they did the one thing Brooks could not tolerate. They challenged his authority by reaching for a phone to call the authorities. The 911 call from Frame Park was placed at approximately 4:35 p.m. Erica's friends reported a domestic disturbance, describing a man in a red SUV who had just assaulted a woman. For Brooks, this was the ultimate disrespect. In his narcissistic worldview, calling the police wasn't a search for safety. It was a personal betrayal, a conspiracy to put him back in the cage he had just escaped. As he saw Erica retreating toward the safety of others and realized the sirens would soon be converging on his location, the last of his impulse control evaporated. He didn't just drive away from Frame Park, he exploded out of it. He slammed the Ford Escape into gear, the tires spitting gravel as he tore onto the residential streets. He was vibrating with a specific, white-hot kind of anger, the kind that looks for a target, any target, to absorb the weight of his frustration. He was a man who felt the world was closing in on him, and in his mind, the world deserved to feel his impact. The geography of the next few minutes is hauntingly simple. From Frame Park, the most direct escape route to the west leads directly toward the heart of Waukesha's downtown. As he sped away from the domestic dispute, He wasn't looking for a highway or a hiding spot. He was looking for a way to scream at a world that refused to see him as he saw himself. He turned the wheel, navigating the quiet blocks where families had recently left their homes to find a spot on the curb. He began to bypass the initial police cordons, driving over lawns and around barricades with a reckless disregard for the suburban landscape. The sounds of the parade were getting louder now, the rhythmic thumping of the drums, the cheers of the crowd, the high-pitched excitement of children waiting for candy. Most people, seeing a red SUV barreling toward a closed-off street, would assume the driver was lost or confused. But Brooks wasn't lost. He was focused. He saw the crowds as an extension of the system that was trying to hold him accountable. He saw the joy of the parade as an insult to his own misery. As he approached the intersection of White Rock Avenue and East Main Street, the transition was complete. He had moved from a domestic abuser fleeing a park to something far more incomprehensible. He pushed the accelerator down, the engine of the Ford Escape roaring as it crested the hill. Ahead of him lay a river of people, high school musicians in uniform, elderly dancers in festive outfits, and thousands of spectators packed 6 deep on the sidewalks. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a side street. He saw the humanity in front of him not as lives, but as obstacles to his flight and targets for his rage. The spark had traveled from a petty argument in a park to the throttle of a 2-ton weapon. He was no longer just Darrell Brooks. He was a kinetic force of narcissistic collapse, and the center of Waukesha was about to become his crash site. At 4:39 p.m., Main Street in Waukesha was a canyon of brick, limestone, and concentrated holiday spirit. The air was a crisp 38 degrees, sharp enough to make the spectators pull their scarves tighter, but not cold enough to dampen the enthusiasm of the thousands lined up along the curb. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the pavement, while the multicolored LED strings on the storefronts began to twinkle with artificial warmth. To the families on the sidewalk, the world felt orderly, rhythmic, safe. The parade was moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a community tradition. There were the Golden Agers, a group of seniors celebrating the longevity of their friendships. There were the Milwaukee Dancing Grannies, women who had spent decades finding joy in synchronized movements and white pom-poms. Behind them, the Waukesha South High School Marching Band provided the heartbeat of the afternoon, their brass instruments gleaming under the streetlights as they played On Wisconsin. It was a scene of fragile, human precision, a moment where the only thing that mattered was the next step, the next note, and the next handful of candy thrown to a child in a parka. Then, the dissonance began. At the intersection of White Rock Avenue and East Main Street, a police officer stood by a line of plastic barricades. He heard it before he saw it, the mechanical whine of an engine being pushed to its limit. A red Ford Escape, its hood slightly crumpled from a previous encounter, bypassed the officer's outstretched hand. The officer later recounted how he shouted for the vehicle to stop, his voice lost in the roar of the exhaust. He even pounded on the hood as the SUV slowed for a split second, long enough for the driver to acknowledge the uniform, before the tires found traction and the vehicle surged forward into the restricted zone. The red SUV didn't just enter the parade route, it hunted it. As the vehicle accelerated onto Main Street, the festive atmosphere didn't vanish instantly. It curdled. For the first block, many spectators remained frozen, their brains refusing to process the anomaly of a 4,000-pound machine moving through a pedestrian corridor. They assumed it was a lost driver, a security vehicle, or part of a stunt. But the lack of brake lights told a different story. The red Ford Escape began to pick up speed, 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. It was a blur of crimson metal against a backdrop of tinsel. The first major impact occurred near the intersection of Main and Barstow. The Milwaukee Dancing Grannies were in the middle of a routine, their backs turned to the oncoming terror. Witnesses described the sound as something visceral, not a crash of metal, but a series of dull, wet thuds. The SUV didn't swerve to avoid the women in their blue vests. It plowed directly through the center of the formation. Pom-poms were kicked into the air like confetti. Bodies were thrown into the air. falling onto the cold asphalt with a finality that silenced the nearby cheers. Brooks didn't slow down. He didn't check the rearview mirror. He leaned on the horn, a long, agonizing blast that served not as a warning, but as a claim of dominance. The carnage moved down the street like a shockwave. As the SUV approached the high school marching band, the musicians were mid-measure. The tubas and trombones muffled the sound of the engine until the vehicle was mere feet away. The driver began to zigzag. This was the detail that would later haunt investigators. The swerving. He wasn't trying to find a clear path. He was aiming for the densest clusters of people. He veered toward a group of children from the Waukesha Blazers baseball team. These were boys no older than 10 or 11, wearing their jerseys over heavy sweatshirts, clutching plastic buckets for candy. The SUV struck them with the force of a battering ram. Parents on the sidelines described the scene as a sudden, horrific transformation of the landscape. One moment, their children were laughing. The next, they were scattered across the street like discarded dolls. The smell of the afternoon changed instantly. The scent of pine and popcorn was replaced by the acrid stench of burning rubber and the copper tang of blood on cold pavement. The high school band's music stopped, replaced by a symphony of screams and the frantic, rhythmic blowing of police whistles. Officers along the route began to realize that this was an intentional act of mass casualty. One detective, positioned near a storefront, drew his service weapon as the red SUV barreled toward him. He waited for a clear window, a moment where a shot wouldn't risk hitting a spectator, and fired 3 rounds into the vehicle's side. The glass of the driver's side window shattered, but the car didn't falter. It only seemed to go faster, the engine screaming as it shifted gears, the undercarriage occasionally sparking as it dragged debris, and in some cases, clothing beneath it. Brooks continued his frantic path for 5 long blocks. At each intersection, the horror was reenacted for a new group of spectators. He drove over lawn chairs, he smashed through strollers. He left a trail of crumpled brass instruments and holiday banners in his wake. The Waukesha Extreme Dance Team, a group of young girls, was hit next. The sight was surreal, sparkling costumes and sequins flying through the air, followed by a silence so profound it felt as though the entire city had held its breath. By the time the SUV reached the end of the main parade stretch, the vehicle was a mess of mechanical failure and human evidence. The front grille was gone. The hood was buckled upward, obstructing the driver's view, yet he continued to navigate by looking through the gaps in the metal. He turned off Main Street, bouncing over a curb and tearing through a final set of barricades, the red metal disappearing into the darkening residential side streets. Back on Main Street, the world had ended. 6 people were dead or dying, including an 8-year-old boy who had been there to see the lights. More than 60 others lay broken on the ground, their injuries ranging from shattered limbs to traumatic brain damage. The Dancing Grannies, a group that symbolized the soul of the community, had been decimated. The parade route was now a triage center. Strangers used holiday scarves as tourniquets. High school students, still in their band uniforms, knelt in the street to hold the hands of the dying. The festive lights continued to twinkle, indifferent to the blood pooling around the base of the lampposts. Daryl Brooks had finished his performance. He had taken his internal, narcissistic rage and projected it onto the most vulnerable target he could find. He had turned a celebration into a cemetery in less than 5 minutes, leaving a city to bleed out in the cold Wisconsin twilight while he drove into the shadows, looking for a way to save himself from the consequences he had just manufactured. The red Ford Escape was no longer a vehicle. It was a dying mechanical animal, gasping for air as it lurched away from the screams of Main Street. The front end was a mangled grimace of plastic and steel, the radiator hissing steam into the freezing night air. Every revolution of the tires was accompanied by the rhythmic scraping of the undercarriage against the pavement, a sound like a serrated knife dragging across stone. Daryl Brooks was navigating by instinct now, turning the wheel with frantic, jerky movements, desperate to put a maze of residential architecture between himself and the flashing blue lights. He didn't go far. He couldn't. Less than a mile from the epicenter of the carnage, he turned onto Elizabeth Street, a quiet, narrow corridor of modest homes and manicured lawns. He pulled the SUV into a random driveway, the engine giving one final shuddering gasp before falling silent. The sudden absence of the roar was jarring, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, haunting echo of sirens converging on the downtown area. Brooks didn't panic with noise. He panicked with a cold, calculated silence. He stepped out of the vehicle, leaving the door slightly ajar, and began to shed the evidence of his presence. He ditched his sweatshirt, hoping to transform from the Math Boy Fly caricature seen in the parade footage into a nondescript, shivering bystander. The manhunt began as a chaotic scramble of fragmented information. In the first 20 minutes, the Waukesha Police Department was operating in a vacuum of terror. Dispatchers were overwhelmed with calls describing a war zone. Early reports suggested a possible sniper or a second vehicle. There was a fear that the SUV was rigged with explosives. The city was placed under an immediate, suffocating lockdown. While officers were kneeling in the blood on Main Street to perform CPR, others were fanning out into the surrounding neighborhoods, their boots pounding on the pavement, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like desperate searchlights. Brooks, meanwhile, was playing the role of a victim. He began walking through the backyards of Elizabeth Street, his breath hitching in the cold. He was looking for a way in, a door, a window, a moment of human weakness he could exploit. He eventually found his way to the porch of a local resident named Daniel Ryder. To Ryder, who was sitting in his living room, unaware that his town had just become the site of a massacre, the man at the door looked like a soul in distress. Brooks looked small. He looked cold. He stood there with his arms wrapped around himself, his voice trembling as he told a story of a life in transition. He told Ryder that he was homeless. He claimed he was waiting for an Uber to take him to a safe place, but that the driver was lost in the neighborhood's confusing layout. It was a performance rooted in the same narcissism that drove him onto the parade route, the belief that he could manipulate anyone at any time to serve his immediate needs. Ryder, moved by a sense of neighborly compassion, invited the stranger onto his porch. He didn't see the blood on the man's shoes. He didn't see the jagged adrenaline behind the man's eyes. Instead, Ryder went into his kitchen and prepared a ham and cheese sandwich. He brought out a jacket to shield Brooks from the Wisconsin frost. For several minutes, the two men sat in a surreal bubble of normalcy. Brooks ate the sandwich with a frantic hunger, his eyes darting toward the street every time a siren wailed in the distance. He kept checking his phone, pretending to coordinate with a ride that didn't exist, while just blocks away, the bodies of the elderly and the young were being loaded into ambulances. The bubble burst when Ryder looked out his window and saw a phalanx of police cruisers screaming down Elizabeth Street. The officers had found the SUV. They saw the crumpled hood and the shattered glass. They were now moving house to house with their weapons drawn, their focus narrowing on the specific block where the red Ford Escape sat like a discarded shell. Ryder, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, told Brooks he needed to leave. Brooks didn't argue. He stepped back into the night, but the world had already caught up to him. At approximately 5:25 p.m., a Waukesha police officer spotted a lone figure walking near the sidewalk. The man matched the description that was beginning to circulate. A black male in a light-colored t-shirt, looking out of place in the sub-zero wind chill. The apprehension was surprisingly quiet. There was no high-speed chase, no final stand. When the officers converged on him, Brooks didn't fight. He didn't scream. He surrendered with the practiced submissiveness of a man who had been through the system dozens of times before. He was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, the metal door clicking shut on his freedom for the final time. While Brooks was being transported to the precinct, Waukesha was still a city in the grip of a nervous breakdown. The search for other suspects continued for hours as tactical teams cleared buildings and searched the riverbanks. The local hospital was a scene of industrial-scale trauma, with doctors and nurses being called in from across the state to handle the influx of broken bodies. Families were still wandering the streets, some clutching single shoes or holiday banners, looking for children they had lost in the stampede. The manhunt was over, but the search for a motive was just beginning. As the detectives began their initial interrogation, they found a man who seemed more concerned about the cold and his own discomfort than the trail of death he had left behind. He was a man who had already begun to distance himself from the act, retreating into a shell of denial that would eventually define one of the most bizarre legal battles in American history. The red SUV sat in a tow yard, a silent witness to the carnage, while Darrell Brooks sat in a concrete room, already beginning to craft the next version of his own reality. Inside the interrogation room of the Waukesha Police Department, the air was heavy with the smell of wet pavement and industrial-grade floor cleaner. Detective Thomas Carpenter and Detective Jay Casey sat across from the man who had, only hours before, decimated the heart of their city. The world outside was a cacophony of sirens and breaking news bulletins, with national headlines speculating on a possible act of domestic terrorism. But inside these 4 cinder-block walls, the scale of the tragedy felt suffocatingly small and intimate. The detectives began the interview with a calculated, low-key approach, looking to peel back the layers of Daryl Brooks' carefully constructed facade. Initially, Brooks played the part of the confused wanderer. He sat hunched over, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, complaining about the cold and expressing concern for his family. He claimed he had no knowledge of any parade. He spoke of being in the area to find a friend, weaving a disorganized narrative of homelessness and bad luck. But as the minutes ticked by and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the detectives began to introduce the weight of the evidence they had already gathered. The first crack in his story was the 911 call from Frame Park. The detectives informed him that they knew exactly where he had been at 4:35 p.m. and exactly what he had done to Erica Patterson. They described the red Ford Escape sitting in the impound lot, the vehicle that was registered to his mother but currently held the mechanical and biological fingerprints of his rage. When confronted with the timeline, Brooks shifted his tactics. He didn't confess. Instead, he began to suggest that the car had a life of its own. He spoke of mechanical failures and honking the horn to warn people, an admission that placed him behind the wheel while simultaneously attempting to absolve him of intent. It was a narcissistic pivot, admitting to the act only to frame himself as a victim of circumstance. While the interrogation continued, a secondary investigation was unfolding at the scene. Forensics teams were working under massive portable floodlights, meticulously documenting a trail of evidence that stretched for nearly a mile. They found more than just debris. They found a key to a Ford vehicle in Brooks' pocket at the time of his arrest. They found red fibers on his clothing that matched the upholstery of the SUV. Most chillingly, they analyzed the vehicle's black box, the event data recorder. The data was indisputable. It showed that at no point during the 5-block massacre did the driver apply the brakes. In fact, the throttle had been depressed repeatedly. The vehicle hadn't malfunctioned, it had been steered. As the detectives transitioned from the why to the who, the room became a gallery of the fallen. They began to read the names of the dead, the grandmothers, the young boy, the pillars of the community. They watched Brooks' face for a flicker of humanity, but they found only a deepening, combative resentment. He didn't ask about the victims' families. He didn't ask if the children would survive. Instead, he began to cry, not for the lives he had ended, but for himself. He lamented the unfairness of his situation, suggesting that the police were merely looking for a scapegoat. It was during this period of pre-trial detention that the investigation took a surreal and exhausting turn. Brooks began to pivot away from a traditional legal defense and toward the sovereign citizen movement, a fringe pseudo-legal ideology that claims the government is a corporation and the law does not apply to living souls. This wasn't just a change in strategy, it was an attempt to dismantle the very reality of the courtroom. He began to demand verified proof of claim and refused to acknowledge his own name, insisting he was a third-party intervener for the person Darrell Brooks. This sovereign pivot created a logistical nightmare for the Waukesha County District Attorney's Office. Detectives had to spend hundreds of hours preparing for a defendant who intended to turn the trial into a circus of procedural interruptions. Brooks spent his days in his cell surrounded by stacks of law books and yellow legal pads, constructing a fort of cardboard boxes to shield himself from the view of the guards. He was preparing to represent himself, a move that the prosecution realized would force the victims to face their attacker directly on the stand. Outside the legal bubble, the community of Waukesha was undergoing a transformation of its own. The initial shock had hardened into a resilient collective identity known as Waukesha Strong. The investigation was no longer just about a criminal case. It was a communal accounting of grief. Rumors had initially swirled about a second driver or a targeted political hit, but as the police released more information, the town had to grapple with the truth that was much harder to digest: that a man had killed their neighbors simply because he was angry at a woman in a park. The detectives eventually wrapped up their final interviews, leaving Brooks to sit in the silence of his cell. They had the DNA, they had the data from the car, they had the footage from a dozen different angles showing his face behind the shattered windshield. The investigation was airtight, yet the sovereign pivot suggested that the road to justice would be long, loud, and intentionally painful. Brooks wasn't just a murderer in the eyes of the law. He was an insurgent against the very concept of order, and he intended to make the community of Waukesha pay for their resilience by forcing them to endure his presence one more time. The case was no longer a search for a perpetrator. It was a battle for the dignity of the dead. As the trial date approached, the detectives and the families of Waukesha braced themselves for a spectacle of narcissistic defiance, knowing that while they had the truth, Darrell Brooks still held the power to disrupt the peace he had already stolen. The 2022 trial transformed into a theater of the absurd, a final desperate attempt at dominance. Darrell Brooks, having dismissed his legal counsel, stood alone, a man draped in an oversized suit and a veil of legal gibberish. He turned the proceedings into a grueling endurance test for the survivors. He argued with the judge over her own authority. He hid behind a fortress of cardboard files. He cross-examined those he had broken with a chilling, detached arrogance, often forcing them to relive their trauma while he played the part of the persecuted intellectual. But the sovereign citizen scripts couldn't drown out the evidence. The jury saw through the smoke. They returned 76 guilty verdicts, one for every life he touched with his bumper. At sentencing, the judge spared no words. She spoke of the utter lack of remorse, the sheer scale of evil, and then she delivered the finality the city demanded. Over 700 years, consecutive, life after life after life. He will never touch the grass of a park again. Today, Main Street has been repaved and the lights twinkle once more. But the silence in Waukesha carries a weight that no parade can ever truly lift. It is a silence held for the grandmothers who will never dance again, and the children whose laughter was stolen by a man who couldn't handle his own smallness. The red SUV is a memory of metal and malice, but the city's strength is the reality that remains. A community is not defined by the one who tries to break it, but by the hands that reach out to help. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.